This is the story of a man named Batty, and what happened in that portion of his life when he found himself in a place that he called New Hampshire. This is the story of the Bat Colony. As a child, young Batty often looked after his mother's shop, picking up a few things about dealing with people. Later, he became a paramedic. He wanted to heal people, and he detested violence. He was a good student and could always pick up new skills rapidly. Though he hated guns, if he had to use one, he would aim carefully. Above all, he was a hard worker. He had a passion for building things, and also, naturally, for his medical career. At the age of 32, he was a fit man with no long-term health problems. But then, one day, he went for a minor medical procedure. What went wrong, no one could explain to him, because he awoke alone, far from home, landing on an unknown world, naked and afraid. In fact, the world was inhabited, but all of the settlements were many days' travel away, and the occupants were not necessarily going to be kind to him. The nearest were owned by the Grey Field tribe, a relatively gentle tribe. The Hadmira Sovereign Pact, some fairly civilised outlanders. Although, also in the region, were the Red Gorge people, a savage tribe. The Hatchet Men, a pirate band, who would always be hostile to him no matter what, and the Liberal Accord of Sedafarussia, an unfriendly union of outlanders. The area he had landed in was a tree-lined plain, although mountains and hills were visible in all directions, some of them with deep caves. There was plenty of wildlife, but not another human being within miles. Horrifyingly, the caves of a mountain to the northwest were infested with some monstrous, genetically modified insects, best to keep well out of their way. Food, shelter and safety would be priorities. Food. There was a large area of rich and productive soil in the middle. It would be best to settle near this and try to grow some crops. Shelter and safety would probably be afforded in the short term at least by bedding down in one of the many hillside caves. But which to choose? There was one quite close to the rich soil, and thankfully quite distant from the insectoid infestation. Helpfully, there were some old walls, evidence that the valley hadn't always been uninhabited. These could be taken down, and the bricks reused to block the cave entrances. He was a medical man, completely unused to killing either humans or animals. He would be forced to learn to fight and kill to survive, he was sure, but at the moment he was naked and weaponless. His first food would have to be berries, from the numerous bushes growing wild around and about. He would also set up a patch on the rich soil to grow some seeds he had found. Rice. They would grow quickly, but not quickly enough to keep him alive in the first few days. While collecting the berries for his first meal, he was aware of a grizzly bear plodding slowly around the nearby grasslands. He wasn't aggressive right now, but he could certainly become a lethal threat if he became hungry. While taking down the two ancient walls, Batty made plans. He would dump heavy objects outside of the cave, while smaller items that he would need regularly could be stored deeper inside. A campfire would be essential, and he set down spots where he could sleep, craft small items, and butcher any animals that he hoped one day to kill. He was a useful construction worker and set to work walling off the north end of the cave to give some semblance of safety before nightfall. He sowed the first few rice seeds and chopped down a couple of small trees for wood, lit the campfire and fell into a deep sleep, exhausted by the incredible events of the day. When he woke, it was already light, and there was a lot he needed to do today. But first, food. The berry bushes were not quite as plentiful as he had at first thought, and they scarcely filled his stomach, but he ate greedily out there in the field, watched by a turkey. Then, the gaping hole at the cave's eastern entrance had to be closed. And finally, the small entrance to the south. When the final block was placed, he was truly indoors at last. He sowed a few more rice plants and then collapsed into his sleeping spot for a second night. The campfire had made it too warm inside the cave, now that it was fully enclosed. The next day, Batty divided the cave into two halves and moved his bed into the cooler half. He hoped that the fungi which grew there wouldn't affect him in any way. It smelled pretty bad. He had enough to worry about without poisoning or hallucinations. He had spotted some old compacted machinery in the rocks nearby, and while he was making a mental note of their location so he could dig them out later, he was completely unaware that a visitor took a look at the valley, but was too afraid to enter. The insectoids could have been enough to put them off, but they were also worried that this crazy naked stranger they could see in the fields might be hostile rather than welcoming. Batty sowed more crops, but they didn't seem to be growing very fast. He was becoming desperately hungry. As he slept the third night, his dreams were full of food, drink and luxury. He may have cried a little. In the morning, he went straight to work cutting as many berry bushes as he could. He then relit the campfire, which had gone out during the night, so he had spent a cold night in contrast to his previous overwarm ones. He cooked some of the extra berries he had gathered and had his first good meal since he landed. Things were looking a little better, but that afternoon his first threat appeared. A totally unexpected one. A squirrel, driven mad by who knows what, was going to hunt down and attack anyone that it could find. At first, it had to pass by the infested cave. Perhaps it would be killed by the insectoids. But no, they ignored each other, and it ran on, heading directly for Batty's small encampment. Batty set to work making some rough and ready weapons. First a bow. He shuddered at the sounds of the enraged rodent scratching and biting at the door. He had never killed an animal in his life and didn't relish the prospect. Also, if he were to sustain any serious cuts, he had no medicines, no first aid kit of any kind. It was quite possible to die from an infected cut out here in the wilds. Thinking better of his chances of hitting a squirrel with a homemade bow and arrow, he made a sturdy wooden club and hefted it. It felt pretty good. He could probably do some serious damage to a squirrel, even a crazy one, with that. Finally, he could delay no longer. He prepared for action. He stepped outside the door. Batty and the squirrel ran at each other.